In this episode we dismantle the engines, clean the parts, steam test the boilers and list parts for purchasing. So having got the brass castings as we saw in the last episode, it's now time to dismantle both engines to their component pieces, ready for the rebuild. So the first thing, we remove the rear wheels by taking off the axle cap. Taking off the rear wheel releases the gear drive and dog clutch, along with the axle itself. Then the burner tray is pulled out and put to one side. So then the retaining clip for the front axle is removed, along with the steering chains. The retaining catch is taken off, along with the chimney. We can now release the front axle and put this to one side. The whistle is undone and put to one side as well, along with the safety valve. The existing steering wheel is removed, retaining the nuts and the sleeve so these can go back together to reuse on the rebuild. The retaining bolt that holds the engine mount is just slackened off, and the supply to the exhaust from the cylinder is now cut through, so we can release the engine frame. Next, the supply from the regulator to the steam chest is cut off. To do this, I'm using a Dremel with a slitting disc in it, as it's a lot easier to kind of use a hacksaw. The two nuts that retain the engine frame to the top of the firebox are slackened off and then undone with a box spanner. This will now release the whole of the engine frame from the top of the firebox. And once again, the nuts are now screwed back on top of the captive bolts, as these will be needed for the rebuild when it becomes a reassembly. The footstep maintenance board is retained with a rivet which is drilled through on the side of the smoke box. This will now release this, because we will need to reassemble this at a later date. The retaining chimney base is unscrewed and the boiler removed from the firebox. The smoke box itself is just a simple twist grip, and with the chimney base removed is now easy enough to take out. The end cap, which forms part of the condensation trap, is prized out with the aid of a screwdriver, as we will have access to this through our opening smoke box doors. The regulator is undone and taken off and put to one side because we'll be reusing part of this at a later date. The burner tray, which fits underneath the firebox, is prized off by removing the 4 retaining tabs and dropping this out through the bottom of the fire hole. For a gas-fired engine we will not be requiring this, but for the one which will use burner tablets, we will be refitting this tray back in place. The main drive gear wheel is removed from its captive nut, and the shouldered bolt and nut are screwed back into the gear wheel for safekeeping. The steering chain's been removed, and now it's time to drill out the remaining rivets holding the steering bracket along with the gear shift mechanism. At the same time, this now releases the tender mount from the firebox, and the brackets are now put to one side. So we now have an assessment of what parts we're going to be using. As can be seen, these components will be cleaned up, the engine frame stripped down, ready for reassembly. As we saw in an earlier episode, the wheels have been built up. We have 2 spare wheels now to assemble for this particular engine, and these are built up the same as a previous episode. Having assembled the wheels themselves to the mammoth rims, we're now filling the gaps with milliput just to finish off dressing up the wheels themselves. Milliput of course is heat resistant, so we don't have a problem with that in the close proximity to the firebox. These are now gathered together with the other wheels and put to one side, ready for the rebuild. So now it's time to clean the fireboxes. This has been done with the aid of white spirit and an old paintbrush, just to remove the soot and grime and any oily residue. The paintwork on these engines, on their fireboxes, is in pretty good nick considering the age, so we won't be stripping the paint right back. We will just be sanding it down to get a good keyed finish for our heat resistant black firebox paint. And now it's time to dismantle the engine frame. The brief assessment of what we're going to be doing is first undoing the crank pin bolt. This is put to one side, and removing the slide valve from the steam chest. The crank pin, having been removed, releases the eccentric, the slip eccentric, which is bolted onto the end of the crankshaft, onto the crankshaft itself. This is undone so that we can now extract the flywheel from the slip eccentric mechanism. The two bolts underneath the engine frame will release the actual cylinders themselves. These normally unscrew quite easily, but I have had it where they've seized up into the cylinder itself and will only come free with a soak of WD-40. I haven't removed the exhaust steam pipe from the steam chest because we may well be reusing some of that at the moment. It will need to be unsoldered, ready for reuse. So both engine frames are then stripped down in the same manner, ready for cleaning. And once again, we're back in with the white spirit to degrease and remove any residue. This is then cleaned off with a piece of blue workshop paper. The gear wheel on this particular engine was a little bit pitted, but that actually cleaned off quite nicely with wire wool, bit of abrasive paper. The clutch dog itself was bent through misuse and was straightened out with a pair of pliers. And the actual mesh of the teeth was perfect, so there was nothing else to do apart from giving it a good clean. A bit of wire wool and the use of the Dremel with a wire brush in it soon brought it back up to a factory condition. And as you can see, the mesh is still absolutely perfect. So it's now time to have a look at the boilers. These can be a bit of a problem sometimes. So what I'm intending doing is giving them a thorough boiler wash, removing the glasses, checking the inside in case there's any nasty surprises. Whilst both of these engines steamed when we first bought them, you don't know what is actually hidden under the boiler itself. As we'll see later, one of these turned into a surprise. So the gauge frame ring is held on by 5 small nuts and bolts. These are then removed, and the gauge glass, which is 2 or 3 mil thick, is prized out along with the seating washer, which in this case on the particular engine we have quite a bit of limescale around the area, indicating this engine had come from a hard water area. Had this engine been run solely on distilled water, you wouldn't have the problem with hard water limescale deposits. In a soft water area, ordinary boiled water is perfectly adequate for running these engines, but hard water will lead to problems long term. So to clean these out, we're using a mix of citric acid, which is mixed up a teaspoon in warm water and tipped into the boilers. As can be seen, it didn't take long for the water to start eating away at any limescale deposits. You can see the water bubbling away on the boiler on the right. This was then tipped out and you can see how the copper from the inside of the boiler has discoloured citric acid mix. The old gauge glasses were put back along with the seals, allowing a steam test to check for leaks. It wasn't long before, having reassembled this, that it became clear that there was an ongoing problem. You can ignore the steam dribbles from the whistle and the safety valve because they would need new seating washers, but my main concern was the water dribbling out behind the back of the gauge glass frame. Having reinserted the existing frames and seals, I wasn't worried if there was any drips from the front, but what I was concerned about was the drips coming from behind the back of the boiler and where the boiler mated up to the gauge frames themselves. On closer examination, it became fairly clear that this particular boiler had suffered from being stored in a hard water area with the water still in the boiler, which had etched away at the brass ring inside, leaving a series of pinholes. It really was a no hope on this one. The boiler was condemned, there was nothing else for it, but we're going to have to buy a new boiler. And so we've got a shopping list. Boiler, whistle and adapter, road tyres, pack of sealing washers, gauge glass and nuts, the all essential tea bags, and a Bix burner. So that concludes this episode, so don't forget to subscribe and follow this project.